Hico, Texas. It is a town in the perfect location, an hour from Waco, 90 minutes from Fort Worth, and 2 hours from Dallas. Being surrounded by people with small town ideas, Hico is a harmonious town that takes education and family time seriously. Hico has many portrait paintings on buildings, including a popular Dr. Pepper one. Hico Elementary School is occupied by passionate teachers who, for the most part, were born and raised in Hico themselves and love their town. The elementary hallways are decorated in creative ways beyond expected. The posters and decorations are colorful, inspirational, and educational. Mrs. Jackson's classroom is decorated with Indian props. She has a teepee next to the small group table. Students can go into the teepee during independent reading study. High School Elementary has a total of 315 enrolled students and an approximate of 25 full-time teachers. Therefore, there is a student-teacher ratio of 13 to 1. That is really small. So, the school's ethnic distribution is 73.7% of white students, 25.7% Hispanics, and 0.3% African American students. The gender distribution of the school is quite even, with 47% female students and 53% male students. Hico ISD is socio-economically alright, or really good compared to many other schools. 50% of the students are eligible for a free lunch, and 7.9% are eligible for a reduction lunch. The STAR test was drastic change for elementary, but Hico did a great job with 92% of students who passed the math test, 84% passed the ELA, and 90% passed the science. Overall, Hico ISD has had an 88.7% pass rate. The percentage of students with limited English proficiency in Hico is 10%, and the percentage of students with learning disabilities is 17%. All staff do an efficient job at accomplishing for these groups of students. Because Hico Elementary has a small town viewpoint where each class has an approximately 13 students, the teacher has an easier time doing horizontal and vertical collaboration. This is when teachers work together with the teachers and the same students. Vertical collaboration is when teachers team up with the teachers who are a grade level below and a grade level higher from their students. This emphasizes how Hico Elementary is student-centered. The school's library is next to the office and the lunchroom at a close proximity to all grade levels. It has books for everyone, and students for all grade levels are in there collaborating and sharing their ideas. The library with windows closed for the teachers and staff to supervise while students work. Something worth noticing was that pre-first grade classrooms are a building next to the second fifth grade classrooms. Despite all grades being considered elementary level, it is important that students feel as safe and comfortable as possible. Hico Junior High and High School are also very close to the elementary. I was assigned Mrs. Jackson as my mentor teacher. She is a dyslexia ESL RTI teacher for pre-K through 5th grade and ESL pre-K through 12th. During this first visitations, I was super excited about the way the environment felt. The school, Hico Elementary, is very welcoming. The room used to assess him is a corner in the library and across from Mrs. Jackson's homeroom. Even though it is public, not very many students come in at all time. However, the corner does not have as much light as wished to prompt better scores. Brendan, a student I was assigned to help that day, mentions that the room is hardly ever used. On the first day, we worked on his math homework, in which he was falling behind on. Math is actually his favorite subject, but because all the reading he has to work on, then he has slowly fallen behind on math. This is something that we were beginning to work towards. I don't like doing ratios, he says. Well, however, I was able to push him to finish the last problem. Mrs. Jackson's commitment to her dyslexic and ESL classes became evident on the second visitation. Brendan's class of 4 have been working on online reading passages. So, to kind of help them with that, she would always have a word choice wall. Students were to pick the word that they believed was most fitting to what they were trying to say. This would help them with their reading fluency as well, because they were to take turns reading aloud on a read aloud. Once they were done, they would choose out all the best word choices that convey the most powerful meaning and connection to the story and add it to the word wall. So the students would also come in on the very beginning. What I noticed on my third visitation is that they would come in and work on their calendar skills, math skills, and weather skills whenever they had their opening assignment, which is a calendar. As you can see on this picture, they have the tens, thousands, and hundreds placed at the very bottom to describe not only those things, but also the day, the month, and the year of that day. And then they would predict what was the weather like outside. So the teacher would take turns deciding on which one would win. So on my fourth visitations, I'm going to move on to this other picture where you can see that it's a math chart. And when they were working on their math, they were to read aloud all of these numbers. At times they would say, point out the prime numbers, point out the even and odd numbers, and so forth. So we were to take turns reading a passage. After each chapter, they took time to write on their journal. Their journal was split into 2 sections. On the left side, there was a column to write wrote quotes. On the right side of the column to write corresponding thoughts, ideas, feelings, and opinions. So the 5th grade group was working on reading a passage 3 times. As mentioned, these students are either ESL or dyslexic, so they are to do a lot of rereading. On the first reading, they were to read along with the narrator. On the second attempt, they were having to read the passage on their own, and it was timed. So on the third read, they were to beat their first read aloud time without the narration. And if needed, then they were to read it aloud to the teacher and practice with her. So going back to what I was saying, there was a recorded time on the bulletin. They had to beat each goal every week. So moving on to this library, the students always had time to read. And as mentioned in the beginning, they had a teepee. Her kindergarten group loved having to count these cards that they had, these flashcards, and there was a total of 150 of them. Each flashcard had a letter, a word, and a picture. The students were to say the letter's name and sound, blend the word, and say the name of the picture. So, for example, there was one that had an A. The student says A. Then they had an apple, so they had to say apple. And then at the end, there was a picture of an acorn. And the students had to learn the 2 different distinct noises, sounds that the letter A makes, and that would be A or A. As mentioned, acorn is with an A. So after these students allowed time to distinguish between each letter, sounds, names, and understand that illustrations could be read, this was so much fun to them. It became kind of a challenge to beat the time. So they were giving 10 seconds per flashcard at the beginning, and they were having a hard time with it. So the teacher went up to 15 seconds. And then after that, after a week, they brought it down to 10. And then towards the very, very end, they were down to like 6 seconds, which was amazing. A lot of the students were telling me that they really hoped that I would stay long enough so they can demonstrate this to me. because I always went on Monday mornings and they would do this on Wednesdays. So I had to find some time to go on a Wednesday and be a witness of this. So in the next visitation, I learned that all students should be allowed the chance to make choices to work toward independence and responsibility. Mrs. Jackson had her fifth graders take all the flashcards that her kindergartens were working on and say them all under specific given amount of time. So let's say 5 seconds. Um, I, I invite you to say this with me, and let's keep a timer, okay? So, apple, acorn. What was that, like 3 seconds? I'm not really sure, but these fifth graders could say it in 10 seconds, and they were devastated at first because, of course, as fifth graders, they wanted to reassure themselves that they could do what the kindergarteners were doing. However, let me emphasize that these students were really having a really hard time reading because all of them were dyslexic and had ESL. But this was just another goal that we had set up for them to reach. So they were so excited whenever, after working on it all day, they finally brought it down to 5 seconds, and they could peacefully, say that they were doing better. So when I arrived at the classroom that day, the students were all dressed for Halloween. It was impressive to watch how a small school can work together to be on the same page about these sorts of things. Because personally, the other schools that I've been to, it's hard to get everyone to do follow a theme. And it's impressive to see how a small town can come together to all share one idea and convey it through these costumes. So Mrs. Jackson had complimented the students' outfits. The students worked on math all that day, even though they were, ready to show off their costume. They had to trace numbers and then practice their cardinality of number. This was the first graders that were doing that this day. I'm not sure if I mentioned it, but because Mrs. Jackson is the only RTI for ESL and is dyslexic students, she gets about 45 minutes with each grade throughout the day, or on certain days she gets a group and works longer with them depending on their goals of that week. So this group of students, they were counting how many counters they had in a Ziploc bag, and then answered Mrs. Jackson's questions without recounting the Ziploc bag. This was a good activity to observe. I will definitely incorporate it into my future math lesson plans, as long as other things they've done, which is flashcards, and then I'm not sure if I mentioned earlier, but Mrs. Jackson always has them do classroom discussions about whatever book they're reading, and they're free to sit down into peace, or go on their desk into the library if needed to. So on this other day, I had to observe Mrs. Jackson and give all the students a monthly assessment to follow up on their position, progress, and goals. So this is one thing that I know for a fact that all teachers have to keep up with, which is data for each student. It's really impressive to see how much the teacher can do whenever the pressure is on and their commitment is strong. So they had to do a daily assessment to follow up on their position, progress, and goals. And this was all done in 1 week for every student in the elementary. A girl who had been coming in from the beginning of the year was tested for special education, and the results suggested that she gets an RTI and move on to a more restrictive learning environment. This was, at first, she said that this was very hard on her, Mrs. Jackson, because she had been hoping that she would test out of it. But eventually, she tested and it came back positive. So at the same time, she says she's relieved to know that she's finally going to get the type of instruction she needs to succeed.